Now I know this title might seem a little bit clickbaity, but I want to talk about the cleanest Psytrance bass that I know how to make. There's a lot of technical things that you can do to make your Psytrance bass cleaner, in the sense of kick-bass separation, in the sense of the tone, in the sense of the way that you process it and EQ it. So that's all that I want to look into today. Hey guys, I quickly wanted to say that my second masterclass is out now on my Gumroad. It's about 24 hours of edited footage of me making the track that you're listening to right now. So go check it out if you're interested. So as you can see here, we have the project. This is the kick and bass. If I want, we can listen to it on a different key. If you're not a fan of A sharp, we can go to maybe something like D sharp. It's a little bit more conventional, but something that I personally don't really like. Maybe you're a fan of F sharp. So you have an idea of what the kick and bass sounds like. So I first want to talk a little bit about what do I mean with clean kick and bass. And for that, we need to look at it through an oscilloscope. So I have a oscilloscope here. And you can see that there are some key factors that make this bass line clean. And the factors that I want to look at is the kick and bass separation here, which is what's happening in this area here. This is where a bass note is playing on top of the kick itself. And generally what we want is we want the kick to continuously oscillate into the bass line. As you can see, there's no real way that the bass line is breaking up the sine wave that is made by the kick. It just continues to post-string, and there's a little bit of area here where it's not a perfect sine wave. Obviously it doesn't have to be completely perfect. It just needs to have this oscillation continue into the actual bass note that is layered on top here. The second thing that is very, very important are the transients. And what is important with the transients is that they have the right breathing room, that they have the right area, so that they can really stand out and they can really give you that click that you want from your Psytrance bass line. So you can see for both the kick here in this example, as well as the bass notes themselves, there's actually a little bit of a volume dip here, which makes sure that the transient happens at the zero crossing, and that from the zero crossing point forward, there's no actual post ringing going into the bass line. There's no part of this bass line that is going into this part of the bass line. This is also true for the kick. You can see that the kick is not being changed by the post ringing. Just to give you an example of how that would look, I'm going to do something very, very idiotic, which is high passing right under the fundamental. And this is only going to happen in here. Actually, I can put that on the bass line itself. That way you can also hear what's going on. If I do this, you can see that here the kick is starting to morph out of shape. We have this bass note that is morph out of shape. You can see that this transient differs from this transient here. In a little bit it will be clear why that is the case once I explain the whole patch here. But you can basically see that this is starting to mess up your kick and bass transient. You can see that this one does not start at the zero crossing, neither does your kick. And these are all not really issues, in the sense that it's still sounding like a kick and bass, but it is like the last 5% of the details. You really don't want this mess. At this level, one high pass, okay, it's a little bit strange to choose to do this, to choose to make your bassline sound and look worse, because I do believe that it falls apart in terms of the gluing of the kick and the bass and the way that once you get into mastering, your transients are going to sound. Specifically right here, if you're heavily going to limit the track that this kick and bass is on, what you'll hear is that there's going to get a little bit of a slide in into your transient. It's not going to sound as snappy and as precise as it would if this was not here. But as I said, one high pass isn't really that big of a problem. The problem comes in with most people who do 3-4 different types of processing on their bassline and they don't look at this. In those cases, what you'll hear is that the kick really just doesn't have a space for its transient. The bassline's transients are just going to be messed up and pushed all over the place, and it's going to sound like a kick and bass, and on maybe some speakers and on some headphones it's going to even sound decent, but it's not going to translate well to professional systems, to better listening environments, and you're going to even have more trouble once your track is converted from a WAV file into, for example, an MP3 file or a file that is used on a streaming service. So normally what is done to actually remedy this is, for the most part, resampling. What you'll do is you'll make your bassline, you'll process it, and then you'll record your bassline, cut it out, and then you'll have an individual note that allows you to add fades towards the end, make sure that all of the processing and all of the post-stringing is contained within the space that is required by one note, and that you don't have any overlapping energies between different parts of the bass lines. But you lose a lot of the customability that you might want to have from your bass line. Maybe in some case what you would like to have is, oh, I'm creating this bass line and now I'm done with the bass line, I can resample it, I'll work a little bit more on the track, and then you remember, oh, wait, actually I want to make a difference in the bass melody, or I just want to introduce a bass melody in general. In that case, you have to go back into your bass line. You have to, if you don't have the patch anymore, you actually have to remake the patch or remake the whole bass, and then you have to resample for each individual note that you want to use. Then you have to manually arrange the bass line in the way that you want it to be, which all of that is a very, very big hassle. The final thing that you might run into problems with is that sometimes what you would want to do is maybe EQ the second harmonic or the third harmonic of your bass line to get them out there and to make them sound a little bit bigger, or to just change the tone of your bass line. But you can run into problems where if you, for example, do an octave jump or you do a melody like before, the harmonics of your bass line are obviously going to shift around, and they're going to change depending on what bass line you're playing and how you're playing the bass line. So what we would ideally want is an automatic system whereby there's an EQ on there that you can use to EQ it, and that will follow the key of your bass line. So to remedy all of these problems, I've created a very, very special patch, and it's the patch that I've been playing here. You have been listening to it, but you might have not noticed the kind of details that go into the patch as we hear it right here. So I want to quickly scroll through the patch. You can see there's a bunch of different racks here. We have our main instrument rack, which is responsible for hosting the Serum, as well as a utility, which is used just for gain staging. This also has an external instrument, which sends its input MIDI to an equalizer here, which I'll talk about later. Finally, this instrument rack is nested within another instrument rack, which is the main big instrument rack that you see here. And you can see that I can switch between the two different instrument racks. In fact, it's being switched automatically as you play, but they're basically two copies of the same instrument rack. So what I want to do first is I want to look at the Serum patch itself, because there's a lot of interesting things that are going on here. So as you can see, we have two oscillators here. And the way that this works is that you can choose between the two different oscillator types that you want. Do you want a processed bassline, or do you want a saw wave bassline? In this case, with the oscillator switched set to all the way down, we're going to have a processed bassline. And all of these macros have been mapped right here. So you can see this is phasing amount, oscillator switch, phase, and EQ, EQ. So those are all mapped directly. Obviously these are mapped in a way that you can modify both of these patches together. I'll get into the other patch and why we have it in a little bit. But first let's look at what is actually going on with this wavetable, because it's actually quite an interesting wavetable. What I've done is I've taken my idea of the phase shift applied using M freeform phase, and I've turned that into a wavetable. So to quickly show you what's going on, I have opened up a new Serum, which is just going to play a default saw wave. Let's place this phase in the middle so that it always triggers from the same point. And here we have M freeform phase. I want to set it to the extreme mode, the extreme quality mode. And what I want to do is I want to turn off the drawing mode. And now I want to turn this down to some amount. I like to go to around 90. So you can hold shift to have very precise control over the point. And then I want this to go to positive 90. Again, we want to get as close to it as possible. Unfortunately, you cannot set values for these individual points. That would be very nice, but this should be good enough for any application that we have. There should not be a huge difference between 90.003 or 90, like we had in these two cases. So what I essentially did was I created a wavetable of this knob being turned up. And if I play this, you can see what's happening. It's actually inducing the phase shift that is commonly associated with bassline creation. Now this is a very, very clean way of doing it, because you're linearly shifting all of the frequencies. You can see that this is a linear formula that is being used for the actual phase shift, the way that the phase shift is being done. So you're not going to have a phase shift on one harmonic that is disproportional to phase shifts on other harmonics. Usually with common bassline techniques, what you'll see is that you'll have a bunch of filters, and those filters aren't necessarily placed in such a way that you will achieve this, that you will get such a clean phase shift like we're seeing here. You can see that the oscilloscope has a little bit of issues with the phase shifting while it is playing, and it doesn't display it very nicely, but you can see from the actual window that the phase shift is nice and clean. So this is the wavetable that came out of this. Here it's a little bit easier to see how clean it actually is. Now I want to premise this by saying that I did use a bunch of different complex processes to make sure that the post-stringing from one oscillation of the saw wave doesn't really shift over into another cycle of this wavetable. What that essentially means is that I had to split up this process into a whole bunch of different steps, but the end result is just a little bit cleaner. And what I'm going to do, if you want to actually explore this patch, is I'm going to leave the wavetable as well as the whole bass patch itself, as well as this preset itself. All those things will be on my Patreon, so if you want to enjoy this bassline yourself, then you should be able to find it on my Patreon. So now that we have this wavetable, as you can see, the first thing that I did is I assigned a macro to the wavetable position. This is what actually determines the amount of processing that our processed bassline is going to have. And that means that there's no processing on the actual bassline itself. All of the processing is already in the waveform. Now maybe you do still feel like you want to have some processing, then what you can do is you can turn this switch all the way up. In my case that is done via the rack. You can see it moving in the synth itself as well. And that will actually shift it to this bassline here. You can actually mix these two in, but that's not really recommended because that's not really what this is designed for. You get some really weird tones if you mix the two together. You can also hear that you get a large dip in volume because of the way that these two are mixed together. So we have our waveform. What we then want to do is we want to obviously filter that waveform, so that's where our filter is coming in. And you can obviously edit this yourself if you want to use the Moog filter or if you want to use a different steepness. You can select a different filter type. And what you want to do here is you want to set up the envelope for your filter. I've just kind of created a standard envelope shape that I like to use. And all of this is obviously set up right with 16 notes envelope mode, so that you don't have to tweak that again and again, but you can just tweak the actual envelope itself. And the same is true for the volume envelope. Now what you will see is that the volume envelope is doing something a little bit strange in that it's velocity controlled. What I've essentially done is I've taken this velocity here and I've assigned it to the Y value of these 2 points here. So that means that it's a little bit hard to see what is going on as you are playing with it, as you're messing with it, but I've set up a standard envelope that should work for most basslines. Now the reason for this is a little bit deprecated in the sense that I was going to use this as an envelope right here on the oscillators, but then I thought about something that is actually fairly overlooked in Psytrance bass creation, and that is the phase that is being changed by the filter that does your actual envelope. We usually don't really take this into account, but this filter, as you can see where its endpoint is actually causing a lot of post-stringing. A, it's fairly steep, and B, it's sitting right around the sub. So essentially a decent part of the processed feeling and the post-stringing that you might get from a bassline is actually coming from this first filter. So I wanted to avoid that. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to have a system in place where this envelope is actually applied to the amplitude after the filtering. Now there's other synths that I could have used, but personally I am much more familiar with Serum, and obviously as you guys know I use Serum a lot. So that's just the synth that is easiest for me. There's a bunch of other things that I wanted to do. For example, this level transition not being kind of level all the way through. That could also be fixed in other synths. I believe you can do it in Vital via remaps and stuff like that. There's probably a convoluted way to do it in Faceplant as well, but I just wanted to make this quick. For me, Serum is just the easiest way to work, so there are some limitations in here. But there is a way to actually do this amplitude after the filtering in Serum. And the way that you do that is through the distortion. As you can see here, I have an X-Shaper distortion set up, and I've gone into Edit A. And what you essentially have to do is when Edit A opens up, is you get something like this. And this is just a linear assignment. The way that you have to read this is like any distortion curve. This is the input level and this is the output level. And then what essentially happens is that an input reading comes in, say that the input level for an individual sample is right here. It just gets mapped to wherever the output level is. So what we want is we want complete silence. And the reason for that is then we can inversely modulate the mix here. and that essentially acts as an amplitude modulator, but this amplitude modulation is applied after the filter. In fact, it's even applied after this EQ as well. This EQ is used as a standard EQ setup that I like on my bassline. So even the phasing and post-ringing that might occur from this EQ is being taken care of. Finally, the last thing that we have to look at is this phase here. This is just a small modulation on the initial phase of your bassline, which allows you to change the sound of the transient. I can also show you what this looks like if we actually move it. Now you can use this in two ways, this phase. One, you can use it to fine-tune the phase alignment between kick and bass. And two, as you can obviously hear, you can shape the tone of your transient. So from here, we have to go into the processing. The first thing that I want to point out is this utility, which is just a gain stage of plus 2 dB whenever the EQ is bumped up. If I place it like this, you can see it reacting to the EQ parameter here. This is just to gain stage against the two cuts that happened earlier on in the chain within Serum itself. The next thing in the processing chain is this EQ here. Now this is going to introduce some phase shift, but we can see from the oscilloscope that that phase shift is very, very minimal. We don't get anything here, we don't get any post ringing here, there's no post ringing here, our kick is still clean, so that was the end goal. One might still argue that this could be done in a different way, and you could maybe use linear phase here, which has its own issues. There's never a fully complete kind of perfect setup. This was as close as I could get it to a perfect setup. Now, while I'm talking about this, it might be nice to point out that if you do have maybe tips or you want to in general discuss this whole setup, then the comment section is a perfect place to do that. I read all of the comments, even if this video has been out for a while, because I just get them chronologically in my feed. If you have anything that you want to add, any questions that you might have about this, you can obviously let me know in the comments. Another good way to get in contact with me is through my Discord server. There's also a link in the description for that. Because I do realize that while I'm explaining this setup is very, very convoluted and very, very complex for what you're aiming to do. The point though is that you only have to make this once. If you were to recreate what is actually happening here, and if you wanted to use these plugins and use this setup for yourself, you just create this patch once, and now you just have a bassline that you can drag into any project and you can work with. And I'll show you how you can work with it in literally any project by actually showing you what happens if we change the key. The way that I'm going to do that is with this pitch modifier beforehand, so that's going to actually set the pitch of our bassline in this case. And what you'll see is that our EQ is going to react accordingly. So this EQ is not targeting specific frequencies of your kick and bass, it's targeting specific harmonics, because it slides along with whatever your bassline is doing. Now for this to work in Melda, there's a bunch of different things that you need to set up. First of all, you need to set up oversampling. I have set up 8 times oversampling, but you can do much more if you want to. There's no real need to do it, 8 times should definitely be enough. The second thing is that you want the shift parameter to react to incoming MIDI notes. And this is fairly convoluted to set it up. So you have to right click, open MIDI settings, then go to notes, and then you have to set minimum values, maximum values, as well as the note range that you want to use. Obviously make sure that it's enabled and that you have a channel set up for this shift parameter here. This is the channel that I'm editing. If I go to a different channel, I can actually select what the target parameter is going to be, and then obviously you have to set the shift parameter. In this case it's already set up, so I don't have to do that. But you can see that I've set C-1 to C3 as my range. This is the range within how the shift parameter is going to work, and then minimum and maximum values to correspond with that. This means that we need to send MIDI note to this equalizer, and the way that we're doing that is through this external instrument here. You can see that we have an external instrument and that we have the equalizer selected on this individual bass track. There's actually 2 equalizers. For the other patch there's one as well. This is something that we'll talk about in a little bit. One final thing to see here is that I have a pitch parameter here. This just allows me to shift the EQ independently of the actual notes itself, because this is going to apply only on the pitch of the external instrument. So I can still use this parameter as if this was the shift parameter. Even though the shift parameter is obviously now no longer working, I still have kind of a shift parameter that I can play with potentially. So I've created a little melody, and you can see that the bass line is actually going to react to that melody, and the EQ is actually going to play around with that melody together. Now I might see that it's skipping some notes here, and I deliberately left in these on-beat notes here, even though this is at the lowest velocity, so this is actually not going to play any sound, because our bassline is velocity sensitive with that setup that we set up before. But still, it should give you an idea that a lot of these notes are not being played by this bassline. You can see that they're not going into the EQ by the way that the EQ is moving. It's only really reacting, as it seems, to these last two notes every time. So what's going on here? Well, what I like to do, to simplify my life a little bit when it comes to kick and bass mixing, is to not have a sub bass on the notes that sit alongside with the kick, on these two notes and these two notes and these two notes, and obviously also the first two notes. So what I wanted to do for this patch was have an automatic system which would switch between one of the other. And that's why this final part here, this macro, is coming in, as well as what you can see moving around here with the different patch and the chain selector. So this is automatically switching back and forth between having a sub bass and not having a sub bass. And the way that I achieved that the cleanest is through the patch itself. What you can do is you can go into your wavetable. This is the edited form of the wavetable. You can see we have a missing harmonic. And then I just went here, remove fundamental. It's actually saying here high pass filter, but that's not technically true because the phase does not get edited when you use this. That's actually very, very important in this context because we don't want a difference in phase between one bassline note and the other. So this is a very clean way of actually removing those lowest fundamental and only the lowest fundamental without actually changing the rest of the saw wave. You can see I have done the same for this one. So if you select the saw wave here, you can see we have a clean saw wave here. There's no phase shift in here, yet the fundamental is not there. Other than that, this whole patch is the same. It has the same utility, it has the same EQing, it has everything the same. It just has a copy of it which does not have a fundamental. Now the reason for this is I still wanted to have the ability to be able to separate the non-fundamental and the fundamental part of my bassline. So if I were to make a new track here, what I can do is I can take this first one and set it to the first. I can take the second one, go to bass, set it to the second. Then I can send this also to Psyscope on its own channel, set it to input mode. So this will be bass high pass and this will be bass normal. And now we can still see the difference between our non-fundamental and our fundamental. And we would be able to independently change the non-fundamental part or the fundamental part if we really wanted to. It's a very versatile system this way. If you want to make your own system, what you could also do is have this LFO just switch between two different serums in here and have the utility be shared and have the equalizer be shared. That way, especially with the equalizer, you have to set up the equalizer once. In this case, what I have to do is I have to set up the two different equalizers in the same way. This is an equalizer. If I then go in here, we have a different equalizer. Again, this is a little bit of a difference between the amount of versatility that you have and the amount of control that you have. So as you can see, what we end up with is a bassline that has all of the benefits of a resampled bassline in the sense that it does not have any post-stringing. You don't have to worry about transients. You don't have to worry about your kick transient being messed up or the bass transient of your next bass note being messed up. But still, you have the ability to just change a note, and there's even the added bonus that the EQ will follow the note that you play. So your EQ is actually relative to the bassline as it's moving along. Furthermore, it automatically separates the part where you want the fundamental with the part where you don't want the fundamental. It just does that automatically. It's just going to assume that your kick is on the first half of the beat and that the second half is the place where your bassline's fundamental is going to sit. Now, while I'm filming this, I will have to say that this is still in development. I still need to experiment a lot more with this, see if I can get it even cleaner. But the general concept is there, in the sense that all of the decisions within this patch, within this whole rack, is set up in a way that allows you to just pop in the bass line, write a few MIDI notes. You have to make sure that there's a little bit of a gap in between them, otherwise you're going to get some strange clicks. That's one of the limitations that I want to get rid of. But other than that limitation, you can just pop it in there and it will be a nice, clean bass line. You don't have to resample, you don't have to worry about all of the processing that you want to do. In fact, you can even after the fact select the amount of processing. There's no real other method of creating a bass line where you can start off with a bass line, write down a bass note and say, actually I want less processing on this bass. Here you have it. Or I want no processing on this bass whatsoever. You can see that both of these are the unprocessed versions of the bass line. This bass line here might look processed to you, but that's just because this is lacking its fundamental. You can still see that this isn't being phase shifted by the fact that we have a straight spike down here and a straight spike down here and a straight spike down here of the actual saw wave. And you can imagine that if the fundamental were there would just be a line being drawn in here, and in fact you can see where the fundamental would zero cross here, because that's where those two lines would intercept. So you can see, very, very versatile. If I play it here, you can see what it actually does when you change the amount of processing, for example. And obviously the way that you would likely use this is you go into summing mode and you set an amount of processing that both sounds good, as well as nicely summing together with your kick. Maybe right now we have our low velocity a little bit too high for this bass note, so I'm going to go in here, edit this, maybe turn this down a little bit more. Let's, for the sake of this argument, just look at a normal rolling bass line. Already you can see that our bass line is summing correctly. What we do have to do is probably set this to just post mixer here, because there's an actual volume dip in here, and obviously that's not being carried through right now. So I'm going to turn this off as we no longer need it. This is what our actual bass line is going to look like, and then we can look at how we actually want our processing to be. Actually, in this case, we can actually maybe turn up the velocity a little bit on this one. With a little bit of tweaking, I was able to get something that looked and sounded like this. And you can see, again, very, very clean bass. So hopefully this video was interesting. Hopefully it wasn't too complex. Hopefully I was also able to explain exactly what I'm doing. I know this stuff can get very, very technical when we're talking about the last details of the bass line. What I want to end with in this video is a little bit of a perspective on why you might not be interested in doing this. If you're a beginner producer and you don't really know what you're doing, you might get carried away with creating your bass line. I know a lot of producers who will work for hours on your bass line. The whole goal of this particular patch is so that you don't have to do that, so that you just have a bunch of parameters that you can edit, one EQ instance where you can maybe shift the tone around a little bit. But overall, the goal of making a bass patch this complex is to simplify it in the actual production stage. Obviously, it's a good idea to experiment and to learn how to make a bass line, and you will find your own technique that might work for you. Maybe this technique just doesn't work for you, maybe you make a different subgenre, maybe you just don't like the sound of this current bass line. All of those things might be the case, and in those cases you have to have your own system. What I would suggest you do is, if you're writing a track, to just don't worry about it. Make sure that you have maybe a sound design session, or that you have an experimentation session in which you make the patch or you make the sound that you use as your bass line, but you don't worry about this stuff while you're actually making music, because it doesn't matter. Nobody is going to stop dancing because the kick-bass phase relationship is slightly off in your final mix. Nobody's going to run away from the dance floor because they don't like the tonality of your bass line, or they may think that the second harmonic could use another dB in level or whatever. These are complex things that we as producers look for and try to adjust because we want to squeeze every last percentage out of what we're doing here in terms of kick and bass creation. Much more importantly is to focus on your music writing skills and to focus on your storytelling, on your synth work, all of those kind of things. That's actually what makes or breaks your track, especially when it comes to something like memorability of your track. A rolling bass line is not going to be memorable because we've heard 1,000 rolling bass lines on 1,000 different tracks. So this is something that I personally do because I know that it's going to speed up the workflow of creating a kick and bass once I'm actually into the production of a new track. I can just throw this in here, write a MIDI, and then it's going, and then it's clean, and then it works. And I can focus on the actual thing that matters, which is the storytelling, the synth work, all of the transitions that I have, all of the theming that I have, all of the things that make your track unique. So this is simultaneously a very, very cool technique that you can do in your productions, and also, if you really think about it, completely unnecessary. Either way, I still hope that you enjoy it and I still hope that you understand it. If you have any questions, again, I urge you to write me in the comments down below. I would happily discuss it with you, even if the video is already out. If you want to have a little bit more of a lengthy discussion, then I also have a Discord server that's usually a little bit better than your YouTube comments because you can send images, I can send you audio files, I can send you examples, all of that stuff. Obviously, I can give you feedback on your tracks and all of that kind of stuff as well. So if you have any questions, I hope that you know where to find me. That being said though, if you enjoyed this technical analysis, if you enjoy these very deep dive videos into, for example, kick and bass, but also other topics, then let me know by leaving a like. That's the easiest way for me to gauge what topics you guys actually enjoy watching. Finally, if you're new here and you want to see more of what I do, then make sure that you're subscribed. Also, if you want to be notified by YouTube whenever I upload something, then you can hit the bell icon down below, and that way you'll get a message whenever I post a video. But that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.